Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for the privilege of speaking with you today on the lasting legacy of Charlie Reich's life and work on the law. Special thanks to my longtime friends Roger Citron and Provost Patty Salkin and the entire team that pulled this conference together. Roger described it as a village, and it looks like this village works pretty well. And it's also an honor to be among so many friends, teachers, and mentors, Harold and Guido and Judith and Denny, Doug. It's been, you've all informed my thinking about the concepts that have already been discussed throughout the day. You can see my furious notes that I've been writing as the day proceeds, as you all are sparking new synapses. But what I hope to discuss with my time is the concept of privacy as embedded in and perhaps underlying the landmark work of the new property that we have all heard so much about today. We know the legacy and the legend of this article, which is really probably one of the greatest examples of engaged and engaging scholarship all at the same time. And I echo what Judith said about the reach of the ideas in Charlie Reich's work, both in the new property and greening of America. And I experienced this on a personal level when I left law school to be a legal services attorney in New York City, and really saw the weightlessness and the rootlessness of my clients, and of what Reich would say, the ruthlessness of the society and the government and the private interests that weigh down on them. But unlike the threats that Reich saw regarding what he would call government largesse, the threats to dignity and autonomy today, I will argue, come mostly from the private sector, as Guido was mentioning earlier in the day, in the form of the absence of privacy, and particularly digital privacy. And I will use the new property as a lens through which to view the threats posed by the uncertain state of digital privacy, the information that we have in our pockets and that follows us around. I am going to discuss the new property a bit, and I'm not covering new ground. We've talked a lot about it today, but perhaps I'm going to look at it, as Proust would say, with new eyes, and try and see if there's another crop in there. And so, contrary to what one might expect from scholarship that was attempting to create a new class of property protections based on the nature of particular interests, Reich did not make an essentialist argument for why certain classes of interests, like welfare benefits and state-issued licenses, should receive greater protections. Although he would say that property is a legal institution, the essence of which is the creation and protection of certain rights and wealth of any kind, with the very next breath he would pronounce that the institution performs many different functions. Indeed, instead of saying there was something inherent in these interests, he made what was essentially a consequentialist argument. Reich saw a growing problem with what he called government largesse. Individuals and corporations were more and more becoming dependent on the government for their livelihood and well-being. As we've heard throughout the day, such largesse took the many forms: welfare benefits, licenses, employment franchises like television channels, and the ability to operate a business, agricultural subsidies. Reich feared that these government-created interests would create a deep sense of dependency that would undermine individuality, independence, and self-determination. Seeking to stay on the safe side of an uncertain, often unknowable line, people dependent on largesse are likely to eschew any activities that might incur official displeasure. Beneficiaries of government bounty fear to offend, lest ways and means be found in the obscure corners of discretion to deny these favors in the future. Thus, what I think was more important to Reich than naming a new class of property interests was recognizing the reasons, the consequences for doing so. And those reasons were not a function of the nature of the interests he had identified. There was nothing property-like in a welfare benefit. Rather, it was the consequences of not having adequate protections for these interests that were the centerpieces of a life lived with dignity and autonomy that rendered the protection of those interests valuable and critical to the individual. Essentialism may have been what he was talking about, and talking about the nature of humanity, but he wasn't talking about the nature of property interests. One of the functions of property is to draw a boundary between private and public power. Property draws a circle around the activities of each private individual or organization. Within that circle, the owner has a greater degree of freedom than without. Outside, he must justify or explain his actions and show his authority. Within, he is a master, and the state must explain and justify any interference. Reich would put it more succinctly as follows. Property performs the function of maintaining independence, dignity, and pluralism in society by creating zones within which the majority has to yield to the owner. Now, while there are instances we talk about zones in property, literally say zoning, I think where we talk more about zones is with, privacy, right? We talk about the zone of privacy. As I argue, many of the concerns about dignity, individualism, and autonomy would appear to spring, for Reich, what may have been Reich's deeper concern with privacy. Indeed, a close reading of the new property reveals a deep-seated focus on and concern with privacy, given the fact that in Reich's mind, the line between the public and private sectors were becoming so intertwined, privacy would be caught in the middle and strangled. As he would say, if public and private are now blurred, it will be necessary to draw a new zone of privacy. So there he goes talking about zones again, but now he's talking about privacy. If private property can no longer perform its protective functions, it will be necessary to establish the institution to carry on the work that private property once did, but can no longer do. For Reich, that work, the consequences of private property include the protection of a private sphere where the individual's dignity and humanity resided. His prescription for how to preserve this dignity and humanity, again, includes references to the importance of privacy and the consequences of not having it. In order to check the dangers of the public interest state, Reich would identify the need for the following. First, the growth of government power based on dispensing wealth must be kept within bounds. Second, there must be a zone of privacy for each individual beyond which neither government nor private power can push, a hiding place from the all-pervasive system of regulation and control. Thus, in Reich's view, the consequences of government largesse are inextricably intertwined with human dignity and individual autonomy, which are both at risk due to the proliferation of government largesse and the threats to privacy such largesse pose. Reich certainly saw the risks of the unchecked expansion of government largesse on human dignity, which reflected a concern for human privacy that would come with property protections for such largesse. Again, as Guido mentioned earlier, what he might not have anticipated was the risk to privacy from what I will call private largesse as it exists in the digital world today. So I'm going to shift now to privacy and digital privacy in particular. Early in the internet age, a now famous line attributed to Scott McNealy of Sun Microsystems. He proclaimed as follows: "You have zero privacy. Get over it." Echoing Mick Mulvaney, right, recently. What we say and do on and through our phones, what we say and do at home in front of our intelligent assistants, home security, and smart speakers, where we drive, wherever we're in public, it's all open for inspection, use, and sale, most of which is without our knowledge. Little of it is with our consent. This information follows us around, creates a sort of digital parallel universe. As someone who went to school in the high school in the early 1980s and lived through the era so bizarrely portrayed in Netflix's series Stranger Things. I like to call this dark shadow world that mirrors our own the digital upside down. If you prefer a slightly more literary reference, it's a tokenesque ring wraith of ourselves, a Nazgul version of our digital and analog presence that stalks us everywhere we go like they would Frodo and the One Ring. Or if you prefer a more current reference, it's like an undead army raised by the Night King. This information is now subject to a form of private largesse. Indeed, as the Cambridge Analytica scandal surrounding the 2016 election showed, even the most careful person can only control so much of this data from getting out. There are 300,000 Facebook users logged into one of these silly personality quizzes. Unbeknownst to them, they gave a researcher access to all of their private information on Facebook. They consented to it, right? What they also did was they consented to allow everyone who was a friend of theirs to give access to this researcher, right? So from those 300,000 people, they got access to the private pages of not 3 million, not 30 million, but 87 million people, all the private information. None of this was illegal. It was all consistent with the Facebook terms of service. Research shows that these individuals were then profiled and targeted for political ads that were favorable to Donald Trump, that were negative towards Hillary Clinton, that discouraged certain communities not to vote, or encouraged them not to vote, I should say, discouraged them from voting. And where was much, if not most, of their activity? In 3 states. Do I need to tell you which states they were? Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It's getting harder and harder to control this information as technology is moving faster and faster, and our laws, oversight, and regulation cannot keep up with it. As quoted in the New York Times just this last week, an investor in a facial recognition software company that is being used by private companies and government alike to monitor our activities, our movements. Here's what he said. I've come to the conclusion that because information constantly increases, there's never going to be privacy. Laws have to determine what's legal, but you can't ban technology. Sure, that might lead to a dystopian future or something, but you can't ban it. Given the nature of this dystopian state, there's a significant price we pay for the ubiquity of digital services and knowledge. And there are a lot of different facets and harms associated with the loss of privacy in this dystopian state. Danielle Citron has talked about the importance of sexual privacy and the risks associated with a lack of sexual privacy, how that can harm self-determination and particularly for oppressed groups. The same is true for what I call political privacy, the ability to search for like-minded people, to explore divergent ideas, to collaborate with others, to bring about social change, to realize self-determination, both individual and collective. A lack of privacy puts so much of this in jeopardy. And I think the new property actually gives us a lens through which to view, analyze, and defend against this private largesse. In fact, we can see in Reich's fears about a public interest state bears many of the hallmarks of this new private interest state. He would describe the outlines of this public interest state where government largesse is the coin of the realm as possessing the following features. I'm not going to read over all of them, but increasingly we turn over wealth and rights to government. There is a merging of public and private. The administration of this system has given rise to special laws and special tribunals. The right to possess and use government largesse is bound up with the recipient's legal status. Individuals hold wealth conditionally. For breach of condition, the wealth may be forfeited. The sovereign power is shared with large private interests, and the object of the whole system is to enforce the public interest by means of the distribution and use of wealth in such a way as to create and maintain dependence. These features, he would say, were similar to feudalism, and the current state of digital privacy shares many of these feudal features. We turn over our digital activities to private entities, which reallocate and distribute them in many forms of largesse. There's a merging of public and private as private entities are recruited to assist government actors with surveillance. As Judith has pointed out, we rely more and more on private arbitration. Individuals are at the mercy of private entity or entities holding their private information, and the terms of possession of digital rights may be changed or increased at the will of such private entities. The failure to act with an unreasonably high degree of diligence regarding the protection of one's digital privacy rights generally means such rights to control over such information is ceded to private interests, and such private interests act with relative impunity with respect to such information. The imposition of a particular type of legal status is both the basis for receiving largesse and a consequence of receiving it. In the era of what Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism, where maintenance of a digital existence is essential to functioning in the contemporary world, to paraphrase Reich, the object of the whole system is to promote the corporate interest in such a way as to create and maintain dependence on such entities for the ability to participate in the digital world. I've already talked about one of Silicon Valley's behemoths, Facebook, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Let's now look at another such behemoth, Uber. In 2012, Uber did some analysis of the mountains of data it had on its customers. They proudly proclaimed the following in a blog post on the company's website, which has since been taken down. You know that Uber loves you, and well, gosh, sometimes it's nice to think that you love us too. But we know we're not the only ones in your life, and we know that you sometimes look for love elsewhere. Well, while you're out loving other human beings, we Uber data nerds are cuddled up with our computers, loving math. What were the Uber nerds doing? Cuddled up with their computers. They were tracking what they called rides of glory. Morning trips that left from a location its users had visited the night before that was not their home. What Uber concluded must have been an intimate liaison, a one-night stand. Here's the trend line they identified, which showed spikes and dips in these activities. Tax day, apparently, very active. Now, this might seem frivolous, comical, or just desserts for philanderers. It was remarkably intrusive. But they've also done the same in China and other places with more political overtones. In China, they tracked the location of Uber drivers, even when they weren't working, to determine if they participated in a taxi drivers rally designed to do what? Protest Uber. One official a few years ago said that Uber was spending millions of dollars to investigate journalists' lives who are critical of Uber. Let me close with this one historical anecdote on the threats to political privacy, social movements, and social change from surveillance. In 1775, when the Continental Congress was first meeting, before the first shots were fired in Lexington and Concord, and a full year before independence was declared, these emerging revolutionaries knew they had to do one critical thing first. They needed a safe means of communicating. They feared the postal clerks operating the Crown's postal system in the colonies. They worried that they might be labeled as seditious if the content of their mails, tracts, and other communications, which were subject to inspection by the official clerks and mail carriers, was revealed to the authorities. In response, one of their first official acts, they created an independent postal system that stretched from what is now Maine to Georgia, and they put Benjamin Franklin in charge of it. Without a safe means of communication, it is hard to imagine the American Revolution even occurring. And this sort of fear of surveillance is only now more pervasive in the digital age, as the Hong Kong protesters are playing what is often called a cat and mouse game, where they are trying to stay one step ahead of the authorities in organizing and coordinating their efforts. Charles Rice, let me just close. Charles Rice would write The New Property and the Greening of America at a time when he believed a new consciousness was taking hold. But just as this new consciousness was forming, something else was happening too. When he would write his most powerful works, these were the very earliest moments of the dawning of the digital age, when its networks were just starting to emerge in military university laboratories. While he would live to see this emergence, he had mostly retired from public life by the time digital and mobile technologies would seem to have a grip on the world, and techno-futurists would proclaim the likelihood of a singularity, yet another new consciousness, through which computers and human intellect would merge. The singularity appears to be upon us in some ways with the emergence of the digital upside down. I do not believe Reich would have welcomed it. While the digital world offers so much promise in terms of the possibility of the community that Harold pointed out this morning, there are also threats, right? I believe the spirit of the new property can help us see a way through to protecting this digital privacy and preserving the self-determination and the dignity and humanity that may come from, that may emerge from the new communities that we can form online. Thank you.